Aren't you glad you didn't let the rain keep you from coming today? Do you feel full? Yes, yes. After service, I had gone up to Nadine and just thanked her again for just an exquisite morning of beautiful, beautiful music done perfectly, as well as just the presence in the way that you are when you sing. And we chatted briefly, and she said, maybe I'll come and do a concert. What do you think? So yeah, better show up. We are blessed. Today we are continuing in a series that I've entitled From Impediment to Empowerment. It is a practical series. It is a series on how do we turn obstacles into opportunities. We are using Ryan Holiday's book, The Obstacle is the Way. A lot of times we think the obstacle is in the way. And this book and this series is all about shifting that and recognizing that the obstacle is actually the way. It can be the catalyst for the growth and the change that our soul is actually calling for. Inspired action is the focus this morning that we're going to be looking at. You know, when we think about it today, one of the most common things we say when we are asked, how are we? We respond and say, busy, busy. And we want to talk this morning about how there is a difference between being busy and a difference between being active and being inspired and engaged. We want to be in the latter. I want to begin by part of a speech given by a woman who was addressing students of a very small college in South Carolina. She began by saying, "I was born to a mother who was deaf and could not speak. I grew up not knowing my father, and I still don't. The first job I ever had was in a cotton field. Nothing has to remain the way it is, though, if that's not the way we want it to be. It isn't luck, and it isn't circumstances, and it isn't being born a certain way that causes a person's future to become what it becomes. Nothing has to remain the way it is if that's not the way we want it to be. Nothing has to remain the way it is if that's not the way we want it to be. All we have to do to change a situation that brings unhappiness or dissatisfaction is to answer this question: how do I want this situation to be? Then we must commit totally to personal actions that will carry us there." The woman then introduced herself to her audience by saying that she was Azzie Taylor Morton. And she said, "I stand before you today as Treasurer of the United States of America." She was Treasurer under Jimmy Carter from 1977 to 1981. The only African American to hold that position up until that point, and the only African American whose signature appears on some of our currency. I went through my wallet last night, hoping up against hope that I could find one with her signature, but I didn't have one in there because I wanted to hold it up. Not just, I knew you wouldn't be able to see it, but I was going to hold it up for you. That says something to me, and I'm so taken by those words of hers, that nothing has to remain the way that it is. We know that in unity, do we not? We absolutely know that. In unity, in this teaching, in this practical spiritual teaching, we know that we always have a choice. We always have a choice what we're going to do, what we're going to think, what we're going to tell ourselves, how we're going to respond, how we're going to act. We deeply believe in unity, that with God all things are what? Are possible, are possible. According to Ryan Holiday, in his book, The Obstacle is the Way, he says that to move from impediment to empowerment takes three interrelated and interconnected disciplines. And those three disciplines are the discipline of perception, the discipline of action, and the discipline of will. The discipline of perception, the discipline of action, and the discipline of will. Say that with me. The discipline of perception, the discipline of action, and the discipline of will. Last week we looked at the discipline of perception. That perception is the way we see things, and that our disciplined action around perception has got to be to practice seeing things objectively. And so, for example, we looked at this example last week, if we lose our job, to look at that objectively is to name the facts and just the facts, right? Sergeant Joe Friday, the facts, ma'am, just the facts. I lost my job. That's neither negative, that's neither positive. It is a statement of fact. But when we do what we often do as human beings, we add a layer of story and then another layer of story and another layer of story that usually, when it is a potential obstacle, it's a negative story, right? And we tell ourselves, and according to the latest reports, I may never get another job. Or do you know how hard it is in my field? Or the field keeps changing. That is then to not just name the facts, but to tell a story. It is to not be objective, it is to be subjective. And when we tell ourselves those negative subjective stories, we impede our own progress. I want to read a piece to you from Eric Butterworth in his book, Spiritual Economics. Eric has got to be, though he's no longer on the physical dimension, my favorite unity minister. I've read every single book Eric ever wrote and listened to many of his tapes. I would have loved to have been privileged to see him in person in New York. This is what he writes in Spiritual Economics. He says, take a careful look at the challenges you are facing. A possible layoff, an important career decision, the inability to make ends meet on your current income. If you identify these as your problems, there's a tendency to see them as static and burdensome, and with a feeling of resentment and self-pity. This simply doesn't work. However, see the challenges as projects, and you tune in on a whole different flow of consciousness. See the challenge as a project, and you tune into a whole different flow of consciousness. Now, I challenged you this month to bring your biggest obstacle, your biggest problem with you to church, and let us work on it together. Let it be the lens through which you hear the message. Let it be the lens through which you're inspired by the music. Let it be the lens through which you meditate. That you bring your biggest challenge here, and we let that be what you work on. Now, what would it feel like if instead of calling it your biggest challenge, you took Eric up on his suggestion and you called it a project? We're going to work on a project together. And what if you called it my great big delightful project? Okay, say that with me. Your second service, so I expect a lot from you. So I'm setting you up. You're going to call it my great big delightful project. Say that real loud. My great big delightful project. Now turn next to somebody and tell them that and convince them that you mean it. All right, honesty time. Did you believe your partner? Oh, you're not so sure. Did you believe your partner? Do it again. Go on. All right, how do we do this time? Any better? Yes. Okay. All right, you can clap for each other. Go ahead. Okay. So your great, big, delightful project Back to Assie Taylor Morton's words, all we have to do to change a situation that brings unhappiness or dissatisfaction is answer the question, how do I want this situation to be? Then we must commit totally and completely to the personal actions that will carry us there. There's no question that action is commonplace. Inspired action, not so much so. So what is inspired action? According to Ryan Holiday in his book, The Obstacle is the Way, inspired action is this. Number one, inspired action is service to our greater life. Inspired action is service to our greater life. Say that with me. Inspired action is service to our greater life. Inspired action is in service to our greater life. Number two, inspired action comes from a higher place. Together? Inspired action comes from a higher place. And then the third, inspired action is part of the process. Together? Inspired action is part of the process. So we're going to look at each of these for just a few minutes. Inspired action is action that is in service to our greater life. So it goes back to that question of Assie Taylor Morton, which is, well, how do you want this situation to be? So when you're looking at that big obstacle, now renamed your big delightful project, you are asking of it and of yourself, how do I want this to be? It's important to give yourself some time for that answer to come from a deeper place within you. I was teaching at Oasis in Mission Valley this past week, and one of the ideas I touched upon, I was talking about how to overcome worry and fear. And one of the things I was touching upon is that in human nature, we often, when one aspect of our life is ending and the new phase of our next life, the new phase of our life has not yet begun, and we're in that limbo state, that we tend to be very uncomfortable with that. And we tend to want to, some of you are really nodding, we want to figure out right now what that is because the discomfort of staying in that place of not knowing is too great. And the consequence of rushing through that limbo place, that place of not knowing, is then we are really only accessing usually our own thinking. We're not getting in touch with the deeper part of our soul. We're not getting in touch with God within us, really, that is trying to tell us a little bit more of what that new place or that new state or that new experience could be. So there's an element of getting comfortable, staying in the question for a little while, and not rushing in so quickly to try to figure out just on your own mental capabilities what that is. So how do I want this to be is not a quick knee-jerk answer, but it goes deeper. How do I really want this to be? And then if we're really bold, we ask that question not of this situation, but about our lives. Well, how do I really want my life to be? Inspired action comes from vision, and ordinary action usually comes in a reactive way to the obstacle. When we are focused on the answer to that question, when it finally does come, and we are focused on the answer to that question, we will find that the action that we participate in is inspired. And it feels completely different. Some of the quotes, let me see if I can find it, that I was sharing earlier this morning at first service. This is from Rhonda Byrne. Be aware of the big difference between inspired action and activity. Activity comes from the brain mind and is often rooted in disbelief and lack of faith. You're taking action to make your desire happen. However, inspired action is allowing the law, meaning spiritual law, to work through you and to move you. Activity feels hard. Inspired action feels wonderful. So when you are acting, ask yourself, is it feeling hard or is it feeling empowering? Is it feeling wonderful? Second, inspired action is action that comes from a higher place within. Inspired action is action that comes from a higher place within. Say that with me again. Inspired action is action that comes from a higher place within. When we teach our children in Youth Village or in We Wisdom Preschool, one of the things we will often teach them is that there are two aspects of our being. And for children developmentally to understand, we'll often speak about it as the big me and the little me, and how we can act from either of those places. We can act from the big me, or we can act from the little me. And when we are acting from the little me, we are acting from a place usually of fear or doubt or criticism or judgment or negativity or anger or resentment. And our actions aren't so pleasant, aren't so good, and don't create wonderful things in our lives. Or we can act from the big me, the higher self. In adult terms, in the big church, we don't call it necessarily the little me and the big me, but we're talking about the difference between the God part of us and our lower human natures. And so understanding that we always have a choice and can make actions and decisions from either place, inspired action is about making those actions from that higher place within us, not from resentment, not from fear, not in a reactionary way, coming from the awareness that we are one with the presence of God. When we really get that and live from that, we respond to everyone and everything differently. The world would be transformed in an instant, if we all operated at that level. Do you believe that? Yes. Okay. The third, inspired action, is part of the process. Why am I saying the process? Because of the way that Ryan Holiday refers to it in his book. He refers to inspired action as being part of the process, and the term the process is one that he has pulled from someone that I learned is one of the best football coaches alive. His name is Nick Saban. At first service, I didn't have all that extra knowledge, but we do have football fans here, and so they filled in the story for me a little bit. Anyway, so Nick Saban is the head coach of the University of Alabama football team, and he does something with his players that other coaches don't do. He tells them, and I quote, "Don't think about winning the SEC championship. Don't think about the national championship. Think about what you need to do in this drill, on this play, in this moment. That's the process. Let's think about what we can do today, the task at hand." So, yeah. So take that big obstacle or that delightful, wonderful project and hold your hands out for a moment and look at that and say to yourself, well, what is the next thing I could do? Not all of the steps. What's the next thing? What is the next step? I shared this at first service. I'll share it again here. We can be so encumbered and actually wind up stagnating and never taking any steps forward if we allow ourselves, when we're thinking about a big project or a big obstacle, if we think we've got to have it all figured out before we get started, we will be so exhausted that we'll never start at all. When John and I were homeschooling, Jonathan and Jennifer, we had been at it for just a few years, and we were still getting a lot of curious questions about homeschooling. Why are you doing that? Aren't you worried about it? How are you going to teach chemistry? How are you going to teach math? What are you going to do with the prom? And it drove me crazy for a while. And I felt very insecure in answering the question because I didn't have the answers. Until one day I did. And I was so grateful that out of my mouth was a God-inspired statement that I needed to hear. And it was, you know what? They're only in first grade right now. I don't think I have to figure out the prom tomorrow. So when you have that big, delightful project, say it with me again, big, delightful project, you can ask yourself, what is the next thing I need to do? What is the next thing I need to know? You know, Martin Luther King Jr. said, take the first step in faith. You don't have to see the whole staircase. Take the first step in faith. You don't have to see the whole staircase. So what would be your first step? What would be your first step? Thomas Troward, a great metaphysician in his day, in what came to be called the Troward Lectures, said, we must do our share in the work and not expect God to do for us what God can only do through us. We are to use our common sense and natural faculties in working upon the conditions now present. We must make use of them, meaning the conditions, as far as they go. But we must not try and go further than the present things require. We must not try to force things, but rather allow them to grow naturally, knowing that they are doing so under the significant guidance of the all-creating wisdom. Isn't that empowering? To know, that you don't have to have it all figured out, that the obstacle really isn't in the way, the obstacle is the way. It is the catalyst that a God, a spirit, a presence, whatever you want to call it, that loves you so much, has allowed to be in your life for now, to birth from you and in you the new, more advanced, more evolved you. It couldn't happen any other way. It couldn't happen any other way. In closing, there are 3 more points that I want to share that Holiday writes about that inspired action requires. One of them is this: inspired action requires seizing the opportunity right in front of you. Seizing the opportunity right in front of you, which means that the opportunity right in front of you may not be perfect. If you are waiting for the perfect opportunity, you are going to wait a hell of a long time. I don't say that word very often, although in some churches it's a very popular word, come to think about it, but not here. So you seize the opportunity right before you, even if it isn't perfect. Because a lot of times it is in the seizing the opportunity that's before you that it begins to become better, begins to be more perfect, or will lead you to an opportunity that is much more perfect. But you know what the mindset is of a lot of people? Is, well, if the opportunity is not perfect, or where I am right now is not great, and they don't love me enough, and they don't appreciate me, and they don't see me for who I am just going to do what I need to do to get by. And when I have a better opportunity, when I have the perfect opportunity, then I will give my all and my best. Who do you think gets hurt in that picture? Truly, the one who gets shortchanged the most, if it's an employment situation, your boss or your company probably gets shortchanged some. But who gets shortchanged the most is you. You're the one that deserves to do the very best. You're the one that will benefit the most from it. I absolutely believe, Nadine, that if you were singing here this morning, and there were only 10 of us, that you would have sung your heart and soul out the same way you did to the group that's here today, right? This is the kind of thing that we're talking about. So right where you are, not waiting for the perfect opportunity, but seizing the opportunity before you and doing the best that you can. That actually leads into the second point. So it's seizing the opportunity before you, not expecting it to be perfect. If it is great, but not expecting it to be perfect. The second that comes out of that is then doing the best that you can right where you are, who you are, and what you're working with here. And then the third is to be persistent with the goal. Persistent when you do get the answer of what is the greater life that you are being called to live. When you do get that answer, be persistent with that goal, persistent with that vision, but really flexible with the plan of how you get there. Too many times I've seen people be too rigid on the plan that they never get to the goal, or I've seen people believe that there's just one plan, and if there's something about that plan that falls through, then they misinterpret that to mean they must need to change the goal. If you've sat in the question and you've really gotten a soul answer for what is the greater life that's trying to come forward into your experience as a result of this obstacle being the catalyst, if you've really gotten that answer, then don't ever give up on that. Don't ever give up on that. Be persistent with that, but really flexible in knowing that the path to get there may very well change in ways you just can't figure out ahead of time. Namaste.